370 million years ago, during the late Devonian period, the world's oceans were ruled by a creature that defied every expectation of what a predator could be. Imagine stepping into the warm, shallow seas of what would later become Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the Arctic waters of Canada. The murky greenish water parts as an enormous shadow approaches, not from below, but from the deep middle distance. What emerges is a nightmare made flesh and bone. Dunkleosteus terrelli, the supreme apex predator of its age, and possibly the most fearsome thing that ever hunted with armor instead of teeth. Picture this: a fish reaching up to 9 meters in length, longer than a large saltwater crocodile, yet infinitely more deadly. Its body was encased not in ordinary scales, but in thick plates of bone, a living tank of nature's own making. The skull alone could measure up to 2 meters across, a massive armored dome that glinted in the Devonian sunlight like polished steel. But it was the jaw that defined this creature, the jaw that inspired both awe and terror in every living thing that swam in these ancient seas. This was no ordinary jaw. Dunkleosteus possessed something far more sinister than teeth. It had blade-like cutting edges formed from bone itself, sharp and devastating, capable of biting down with a force that modern paleontologists estimate at over 5,000 pounds per square inch. These weren't flexible jaws either. The very name, quote, zero, means, quote, one, and that jointed neck allowed the creature to open its massive mouth with a gape that could swallow prey whole. Not only could it open its mouth impossibly wide, but it could do so with lightning speed, creating a powerful suction that pulled prey directly into its throat before the unfortunate victim even realized it was too late to escape. Dunkleosteus was not just a predator. It was the definition of apex predator, the unchallenged ruler of Devonian oceans that would dominate for millions of years before its mysterious extinction. It was a creature of pure predatory efficiency, an evolutionary masterpiece of hunting design that makes modern great white sharks look like humble scavengers by comparison. For the fish, arthropods, and early marine creatures sharing its world, Dunkleosteus wasn't just a hunter. It was the reaper incarnate, the inevitable end waiting in every shadowed current, the age of armored dragons. The Devonian period, lasting from approximately 419 to 359 million years ago, earned the nickname Age of Fishes for good reason. But this was not an age of peaceful, mindless swimming. These were oceans in revolution, where new forms of life experimented with body plans, hunting strategies, and defensive mechanisms that would shape the evolution of every creature that came after. Dunkleosteus belonged to an extraordinary group of fish called placoderms, literally plate-skinned fish. These were not the ancestors of modern fish. They were an entirely different branch of vertebrate evolution, a separate experiment in how to build a large predator from scratch. The placoderm lineage began much earlier, in the Silurian period over 430 million years ago, and for over 70 million years, they ruled the seas unchallenged. But Dunkleosteus was something special, even among these armored fish. While its relatives like Dunkleosteus were bottom-dwelling, slow-moving, benthic predators that lurked on the seafloor, waiting for prey to stumble past, Dunkleosteus was a pelagic predator, an open-water hunter. It was built for speed and endurance, a lethal swimmer with a muscular body that modern paleontological analysis suggests looked remarkably similar to a massive white shark, with a wide caudal fin and a narrow peduncle that allowed for powerful, energy-efficient swimming. The Devonian seas that Dunkleosteus called home were vastly different from the oceans of today. These were subtropical and tropical waters, warm and teeming with life. Continental configurations were alien. Land masses that would later become North America, Europe, and Asia Minor were in completely different positions. Shallow inland seas covered much of what is now the American Midwest, creating vast marine basins that teemed with extraordinary diversity. It was into this world that Dunkleosteus evolved, and it immediately dominated. The fossil record shows that multiple species of Dunkleosteus existed, with Dunkleosteus terrelli being the largest and most formidable. But all of them shared the same basic design: armored, efficient, and absolutely lethal. the body of a hunter, the soul of a killer. The anatomy of Dunkleosteus was a masterpiece of predatory specialization. Every bone and plate configured for one purpose: hunting and killing large prey with devastating efficiency. Understanding this creature means understanding how evolution designed the perfect apex predator for open water hunting. The skull was the most immediately impressive feature. Measuring up to 2 meters in length and covered with thick bone plates of varying sizes, the skull of a large Dunkleosteus was an engineering marvel. These plates, called dermal bones, interlocked with incredible precision, creating a structure that was both rigid and surprisingly flexible at key points. The way the skull plates articulated allowed for complex jaw movements impossible in most fish. The most critical joint was the craniothoracic articulation, the hinge point between the skull and the thorax, or chest region. This joint allowed the front of the skull to pivot upward dramatically, creating that extra-wide gape that gave placoderms their deadly advantage. The eyes of Dunkleosteus were positioned on the sides of its head, giving it excellent lateral vision to track moving prey. But more importantly, the eye sockets were large, indicating good visual acuity. This was a predator that hunted by sight, not by smell or electroreception, like many modern sharks. It had to see its prey to track it, and once it locked eyes on a meal, that meal was doomed. But it was the jaw that defined Dunkleosteus. Where modern fish have rows of teeth, Dunkleosteus had something far more devastating: sharp, blade-like edges of exposed bone that formed the cutting edges of its jaws. These weren't teeth in the traditional sense. They were more like built-in knife blades that never needed replacement, never dulled, never wore out. The biomechanics of these jaws were studied by paleontologist Anderson, who determined that the bite force of Dunkleosteus could reach approximately 5,600 pounds per square inch in large specimens. This is more than 5 times the bite force of a modern great white shark, and in a mouth that was proportionally massive. The body behind the skull was equally impressive. While we don't have complete skeletons of Dunkleosteus, most fossils consist of disarticulated skull and thoracic plates that sank to the bottom separately after the creature died. We can infer the body structure from related species and from the portions of pectoral fin that have been discovered. These fins show sturdy bone structures, indicating powerful muscles for swimming. The body was likely flexible but strong, with a streamlined profile that allowed for rapid acceleration and sustained pursuit of prey. The armor plating extended from the skull all the way down the body in articulated segments. These plates were made of dense bone, some sections reaching thicknesses of several centimeters. Unlike the vulnerable skin and soft tissue of most fish, Dunkleosteus was covered in armor that would have made it essentially immune to the bites of smaller predators. The overlapping arrangement of plates provided both protection and the flexibility needed for a swimming predator to move efficiently through water. The most remarkable aspect of Dunkleosteus's anatomy was the combination of features that made it such an effective open water predator. The streamlined body, the powerful fins, the accelerated jaw mechanism, the suction feeding capability. All of these evolved together as an integrated system. This was not a creature that stumbled upon an effective hunting strategy. This was evolution with purpose, creating a predator so specialized for its role that nothing in its world could effectively challenge it. Hunter of the Devonian depths. What did Dunkleosteus eat? Who did it hunt? What were the terrifying final moments of its prey? Based on fossil evidence, paleontologists believe that Dunkleosteus was an opportunistic predator with a diet that shifted as the creature grew. Juvenile Dunkleosteus, while still formidable compared to other fish, likely fed on smaller fish, crustaceans, and early cephalopods. The fossil record shows bite marks on ammonoids, the coiled cephalopods that dominated Devonian oceans, that match the jaw structure of Dunkleosteus. These ammonoids could reach significant sizes themselves, some up to 1 meter or more in diameter. But for a growing Dunkleosteus, they were manageable prey. As Dunkleosteus reached full size, its diet became more ambitious. Large fish became its primary target. The Devonian seas contained many massive fish species, lobe-finned fish called sarcopterygians that could reach lengths of several meters. These were serious prey, armored and fast, with their own defensive capabilities. But a full-grown Dunkleosteus could take them. The power of its bite, combined with its speed and the suction feeding mechanism created by its expandable gill arches, made it capable of capturing and killing even large, powerful fish. Some paleontologists have speculated that large Dunkleosteus may have occasionally hunted the early marine reptiles that were beginning to appear during the late Devonian, though this remains controversial. What is certain is that Dunkleosteus sat at the absolute apex of the marine food chain, with no natural predators and no competitors for the largest prey items. The hunting strategy of Dunkleosteus was likely similar to that of modern apex predators like great white sharks or saltwater crocodiles. As a pelagic hunter, it would have spent much of its time in open water, patrolling established territory. Its excellent vision would have allowed it to spot potential prey from a significant distance. Once prey was identified, Dunkleosteus would likely accelerate toward it, using its powerful tail to generate speed. The final attack would have been explosive, a sudden lunge with that massive mouth opening to create a suction effect, drawing the prey into the waiting jaws. The blade-like bone edges would have inflicted catastrophic damage, often severing prey items or slicing deep into their bodies. For large prey that couldn't be swallowed whole, Dunkleosteus would have fed on the pieces, its jaws capable of tearing and dismembering even the most robust prey. The Devonian fish that shared the ocean with Dunkleosteus lived in constant fear. Every shadow could be the approach of death. Every moment in open water was a gamble with fate. The appearance of a Dunkleosteus in a region would have caused panic among the smaller fish populations, driving them into shallow water or into hiding among the rapidly growing seaweed forests that began to develop during this period. Devonian seas, the world of Dunkleosteus. To truly understand Dunkleosteus, one must understand the world in which it lived. The Devonian seas were not the deep, dark abysses of the modern ocean. Instead, they were mostly shallow, warm, and incredibly productive. The seas that covered the region that would become Ohio and the northern United States were subtropical, with water temperatures averaging 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The seafloor was a complex landscape of sandflats, mud, and early coral-like structures. These Devonian corals were fundamentally different from modern corals. Some were solitary rather than colonial, and they created complex three-dimensional structures on the seafloor. Around these structures, life bloomed. Small fish darted between the coral heads, hunting the abundant invertebrates. Trilobites, those iconic arthropods of the Paleozoic, still dominated the invertebrate fauna, ranging in size from a few millimeters to nearly a meter in length. These arthropods would have been easy prey for Dunkleosteus, their hard exoskeletons no match for those powerful jaws. The seaweed forests mentioned in Devonian fossil records tell us much about the environmental conditions. As land plants spread during the Devonian, they revolutionized terrestrial habitats, stabilizing soils and capturing runoff. This meant that coastal waters near river mouths became rich in nutrients, supporting vast expanses of macroalgae and the earliest forms of marine plants. These forests provided shelter for smaller animals and nurseries for juvenile fish, though even here, danger was never far away if a hungry Dunkleosteus passed through. The Devonian is famous as the age of fishes, and the variety of fish life was astounding. Alongside Dunkleosteus and other placoderms swam the early sharks, the most primitive representatives of that lineage that would eventually dominate the modern ocean. These early sharks were smaller than Dunkleosteus and avoided direct competition by hunting smaller prey or occupying different depths and regions. The lobe-finned fish, Sarcopterygians, were another major group, some of which were growing large and developing the limb-like fins that would eventually lead to tetrapods. The climate of the Devonian was changing throughout this period. The early Devonian was generally warm and moist, supporting abundant life. But as the period progressed, there were cycles of warming and cooling, possibly driven by changes in CO2 levels and ocean circulation patterns. These climatic shifts would have influenced prey populations, which in turn would have affected Dunkleosteus and other predators. During warmer periods, the shallow seas would have been even more productive, supporting larger populations of prey fish. During cooler periods, when water temperatures dropped, the fish populations would have become more stressed, potentially making them easier prey for a predator as efficient as Dunkleosteus. The Devonian seas were also more oxygenated than the oceans that came later, though there were regions of lower oxygen water, particularly in deeper basins and partially enclosed seas. Dunkleosteus, as an active pelagic hunter, would have required well-oxygenated water to support its high metabolism and active lifestyle. It would have therefore stayed in shallow to mid-depth waters, where oxygen levels remained high enough to sustain its hunting activities. Anatomy, the architecture of predatory perfection. Let us examine in greater detail the specialized anatomical features that made Dunkleosteus such a devastating predator. Every aspect of its body tells a story of evolutionary refinement directed toward a single goal: efficient predation. The armored skeleton. Unlike modern fish, which have bones that are relatively light and sometimes somewhat flexible, Dunkleosteus had an exoskeleton, a system of external plates that covered the head and anterior body, like a suit of medieval armor. These plates were made of dermal bone, bone that formed directly in the skin rather than as a replacement for cartilage. The plates articulated with each other, connected by joints and ligaments that allowed precise movement while maintaining structural integrity. The skull plates were not all the same. Some were rough and pitted, perhaps providing attachment points for powerful muscles. Others were smooth and curved, aerodynamically optimized for movement through water. The arrangement of these plates shows that the skull was not a solid, immovable block, but rather a sophisticated structure with multiple joints that allowed complex movements. The premaxillary and maxillary plates in the upper jaw could move independently of the cranium, contributing to the creature's feeding mechanism. The thoracic armor, the plates that covered the shoulder region and anterior body, was particularly impressive. These were large, shield-like structures that protected the vital organs and provided attachment points for the powerful muscles that drove the fins. The most important joint in the entire skeleton was the craniothoracic articulation, the hinge between the skull and the thorax. This joint was flexible in a way that allowed the front of the skull to rotate upward, creating that devastating gape that made Dunkleosteus so lethal. The jaws and feeding apparatus. The jaw mechanism of Dunkleosteus represents one of evolution's most ingenious solutions to the problem of capturing large, powerful prey. Unlike modern fish with rows of teeth, Dunkleosteus had a different system entirely. The cutting edges of the jaws were formed from bone itself, specifically from a specialized region of the maxilla and dentary bones. These edges were razor sharp, much like the blade of a knife, and they could be maintained indefinitely because they were living bone, constantly being replaced at the microscopic level. No need to shed and regrow teeth. The blades simply renewed themselves from within. The actual mechanism of feeding in Dunkleosteus was likely complex. When the mouth opened, the cranium rotated upward around the craniothoracic joint, creating an extra-wide gape. The gill arches expanded, creating a negative pressure, a suction effect, that pulled prey into the mouth. This suction feeding mechanism is similar to what we see in modern fish like pike and pickerel, but scaled up to monstrous proportions. Once prey was in the mouth, the jaws could snap shut with tremendous force, and the blade-like edges would slice through flesh and bone with equal efficiency. Studies on the biomechanics of the jaw suggest that Dunkleosteus could have generated bite forces exceeding 5,000 pounds per square inch in large specimens. This is not just a hypothetical number. It's based on careful analysis of the leverage advantages of the jaw structure, the size of the attachment points for muscles, and comparative analysis with other animals. For perspective, a modern great white shark generates a bite force of approximately 4,000 psi, and that is considered devastating. Dunkleosteus exceeded even that. The fins and swimming. While we don't have complete skeletons of Dunkleosteus, the portions of pectoral fins that have been preserved tell us much about how this creature swam. The pectoral fins were robust, with strong internal bone support. They were not the delicate, paddle-like fins of many modern fish, but rather powerful appendages capable of providing precise steering and maneuvering. The caudal fin, the tail, is inferred from related species and from the general body proportions. Modern reconstruction suggests that Dunkleosteus had a caudal fin with a pronounced lower lobe and a narrower peduncle. the narrowest part of the body just before the tail. This configuration is known as heterocircle in structure and is ideal for a hunting predator. The wide lower lobe would have generated powerful thrust for rapid acceleration, while the streamlined peduncle would have minimized drag during cruising. The overall body plan, reconstructed from the available evidence, suggests that Dunkleosteus was a powerful, fast swimmer. Unlike some of the bottom-dwelling placoderms like Dunkleosteus, which were adapted for slow, energy-efficient cruising along the seafloor, Dunkleosteus was built for active pursuit of prey. Its hydrodynamic shape, its muscular body, and its fin configuration all point to an animal capable of sudden acceleration and sustained pursuit speeds that would have exceeded those of most prey fish. The Devonian extinction, the mystery of Dunkleosteus's disappearance. For over 50 million years, Dunkleosteus reigned supreme in the oceans of the Devonian. Multiple species evolved and thrived, spreading across the shallow seas that covered much of the world. But then, near the end of the Devonian period, everything changed. The late Devonian extinction events, there were actually multiple extinction pulses separated by thousands or tens of thousands of years, spelled doom for the placoderms. Dunkleosteus and all of its relatives disappeared from the fossil record. The cause of this extinction remains one of paleontology's most debated questions. The leading hypothesis centers on environmental change. During the late Devonian, the world's climate shifted toward cooler, more variable conditions. Ocean circulation patterns changed, potentially creating more stagnant conditions in the shallow seas where Dunkleosteus lived. Oxygen levels in these seas appear to have declined significantly. Fossil evidence suggests the development of, quote, 4 areas of very low oxygen that could not support aerobic life. For a creature like Dunkleosteus, with its high metabolic demands and its dependence on oxygen-rich water to support its active lifestyle, such conditions would have been catastrophic. As oxygen levels declined, the fish populations that Dunkleosteus depended upon for food would have suffered heavily. Many would have been forced into small refugia of oxygenated water, crowding together in ever smaller areas. The perfect storm, rising temperatures in tropical seas, falling oxygen levels, declining food supplies, created conditions that no apex predator could survive. Additionally, the diversification of early sharks during the latter part of the Devonian may have provided competition for the remaining food resources. While these early sharks were smaller and less formidable than Dunkleosteus, they were more efficient hunters in certain respects and capable of thriving in a wider range of environmental conditions. The extinction of the placoderms was sudden in geological terms, occurring over a period of perhaps 1 to 3 million years during the late Devonian. By the end of the Devonian period, Dunkleosteus was gone. All placoderms were gone. Only the sharks and the early actinopterygian fish, the ancestors of modern bony fish, survived the catastrophe. The extinction of Dunkleosteus vacated the ecological niche of apex predator. This void would not remain empty for long. In the oceans that followed, the sharks diversified and grew larger, eventually producing creatures like Megalodon 350 million years later, a shark that would fill a similar ecological role to what Dunkleosteus had occupied. But Dunkleosteus itself was truly gone, leaving only fossils and the scientific reconstructions that allow us to appreciate what it was. Discovery and study: how scientists piece together the puzzle. The first scientific specimens of Dunkleosteus were collected in 1867 by a naturalist named J. Terrell in Ohio during excavations of Devonian rocks. The bones were so unusual that scientists initially struggled to classify them. The name given to these early specimens was Dinichthys, meaning a name that would later be superseded by Dunkleosteus, which means named for David Dunk, a collector who provided many important specimens. The challenge in understanding Dunkleosteus lies in the nature of placoderm fossils. When a Dunkleosteus died in the open ocean and sank to the bottom, the soft tissues would have been rapidly decomposed or eaten by scavengers. The massive, heavy bone plates would have sunk relatively quickly, but the lighter vertebrae and other skeletal elements would have floated or been dispersed. This meant that almost all Dunkleosteus fossils that have been recovered consist of disarticulated skull and thoracic plates, found separately or in jumbled combinations. Complete or near-complete skeletons of Dunkleosteus remain extraordinarily rare. Most knowledge about the body plan comes from comparison with other, better-preserved placoderms, particularly Dunkleosteus and other arthroderes that have been found in deposits where they were rapidly buried, preventing disarticulation. Modern paleontologists use sophisticated computer modeling and biomechanical analysis to understand how Dunkleosteus functioned. By examining the geometry of the skull plates, the leverage advantages of the jaw muscles, and the structure of the vertebral column and fins, researchers can create detailed models of how the animal swam, how it opened its mouth, and how much force it could generate with its bite. One particularly important discovery came when the pectoral fin remains were subjected to detailed anatomical analysis. These bones showed that the fins of Dunkleosteus were robust and powerful, with bone structure suggesting high muscle mass. This evidence supported the modern reconstruction of Dunkleosteus as an active, pelagic predator, rather than a slow bottom dweller. Life and death in the Devonian, a predator's existence. What was it actually like to be a Dunkleosteus? What was the daily existence of this apex predator? A juvenile Dunkleosteus, having just consumed the remains of smaller fish, would have begun its pattern of search and hunt. The Devonian seas offered abundant food, but competition was growing. Other placoderms, early sharks, and large lobe-finned fish all sought prey. Juveniles had to be careful. They could become prey themselves if they encountered larger placoderms or other dangerous predators. A juvenile would have spent its early years in more protected waters, perhaps in shallower areas or in coral reef systems where hiding places were abundant. These were nursery grounds, where young fish of many species congregated, taking advantage of the abundant food and protective structure. But predators knew this too. A juvenile Dunkleosteus would have been a formidable predator in this environment, large enough to subdue most fish, but small enough to be vulnerable to larger placoderms and possibly to large sharks. Growth in Dunkleosteus was presumably rapid during the juvenile stages, fueled by the abundant food available in the Devonian seas. As the creature grew, it would have gradually moved into deeper, more open water. By the time it reached sexual maturity, an event that probably occurred when the creature was 4 to 6 meters in length, it would have been a fearsome predator, approaching its full size. The daily life of an adult Dunkleosteus would have been largely solitary. There is no evidence that placoderms were social animals. An adult would have maintained a territory, perhaps ranging over many square kilometers of open water. This territory would have been large enough to provide sufficient prey to sustain such a large, metabolically demanding predator. Feeding was the primary activity. Estimates suggest that an adult Dunkleosteus would have needed to consume significant amounts of meat daily. A large fish meal might provide hundreds of calories, but given the energy demands of an active predator, Dunkleosteus might have needed to make several successful hunts per week to maintain its body condition. Between hunts, Dunkleosteus would have engaged in what we might call cruising behavior, swimming slowly through open water, using its excellent vision to scan for potential prey. The murky waters of the Devonian would not have been completely opaque. Sunlight would have penetrated the upper layers, providing good visibility at mid-depths. An alert Dunkleosteus could have spotted a promising prey fish from considerable distance. The onset of sexual maturity would have brought behavioral changes. During breeding season, Dunkleosteus would have had to seek out partners. This likely required some form of chemical signaling, scent trails released into the water that other Dunkleosteus could follow. Males and females would have had to recognize each other and engage in some form of courtship before mating could occur. Reproduction in placoderms remains largely mysterious, as soft tissue evidence is essentially absent from the fossil record. However, analysis of fossilized reproductive structures in some placoderms suggests that some bore live young, while others laid eggs. Dunkleosteus likely gave birth to a small number of live young that would have been miniature versions of the adults, complete with the characteristic jaw structure and armor plating. Dunkleosteus and its world, coexistence and extinction. Dunkleosteus did not exist in isolation. The Devonian seas hosted a bewildering variety of life forms, each occupying its own ecological niche. The early sharks were present throughout the Devonian, small by modern standards, most measured less than 2 meters in length, but already developing the basic shark body plan that would prove so successful. These sharks occupied somewhat different ecological niches from Dunkleosteus, often in deeper waters or cooler regions. Where they did overlap with Dunkleosteus, competitive interactions would have occurred, though a large adult Dunkleosteus could likely have intimidated most early sharks. The lobe-finned fish, or sarcopterygians, were another major predatory group. Some of these, like Tiktaalik, which appeared later in the Devonian, were developing limb-like fins suitable for shallow water hunting and even brief periods on land. These fish competed with Dunkleosteus for prey, but occupied slightly different niches, particularly in shallow water and estuary environments. The invertebrate fauna was diverse and abundant. Trilobites, while declining in diversity compared to earlier periods, were still important components of Devonian ecosystems. Ammonoids, the coiled cephalopods, were especially important as prey for many predators. Some ammonoids reach sizes of a meter or more, making them substantial meals even for a predator as large as Dunkleosteus. The Devonian also saw the explosion of fish diversity. Countless species of small fish, many now extinct and known only from fossils, filled every conceivable ecological role. Some were filter feeders, sieving plankton from the water. Others were small benthic hunters, feeding on invertebrates on the seafloor. Still others were open water schooling fish, living in safety in numbers. All of these provided food for Dunkleosteus and other predators. As the Devonian drew to a close, environmental stress began to build. Ocean oxygen levels declined, particularly in the shallow epicontinental seas where most life concentrated. Temperature shifted, though not dramatically. More importantly, there were changes in ocean circulation and nutrient cycling that stressed the delicate balance of these ecosystems. For Dunkleosteus, these changes were catastrophic. As oxygen levels fell, the creatures could not sustain the high metabolic rates necessary for active hunting. As food supplies diminished due to extinction of prey species, even reduced hunting became insufficient to sustain such large predators. The end came not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding extinction as populations dwindled and finally vanished. The legacy of Dunkleosteus, an evolutionary dead end. Dunkleosteus left no descendants. The entire placoderm lineage, a branch of vertebrate evolution that had persisted for over 70 million years, disappeared without producing any living descendants. This was an evolutionary dead end, one of evolution's many experiments that, despite its brilliant initial success, ultimately failed to adapt to changing conditions. The sharks that survived the Devonian extinction and subsequently diversified filled the ecological niche that Dunkleosteus had occupied. Over hundreds of millions of years, sharks would produce their own apex predators, culminating in creatures like Megalodon, which hunted in similar ways, but with a completely different body plan, built around teeth rather than bone-edged jaws. The closest living relatives to Dunkleosteus would be modern fish, as all vertebrates are descended from common ancestors. But there is no direct lineage from Dunkleosteus to any modern creature. The placoderms were a side branch of vertebrate evolution, distantly related to sharks, bony fish, and ultimately to tetrapods, including ourselves. When the placoderms disappeared, that entire branch of the vertebrate family tree was severed, leaving us with no living examples of these armored predators. The study of Dunkleosteus and other placoderms provides crucial insights into vertebrate evolution and the principles that govern the design of predatory organisms. The solutions that Dunkleosteus evolved, the suction feeding mechanism, the blade-like jaws, the streamlined body plan, the powerful fins, were all independently arrived at or refined by later predators. Nature, it seems, tends to reach similar solutions to similar problems. Conclusion. The monster that dominated an age, Dunkleosteus was not the largest predator ever to exist in Earth's oceans, but few creatures have been more perfectly designed for their role as apex predators. In the warm Devonian seas, this armored dragon reigned unchallenged, the ultimate expression of predatory specialization. Every aspect of its anatomy, from the massive jaws to the streamlined body, was finely tuned for hunting large prey in open water. For millions of years, fish lived in fear of these monsters. Their appearance in a region would have sent schools of fish fleeing in panic. Their hunting success rate, while not 100%, would have been extraordinarily high compared to most modern predators. They were the kings of the Devonian seas, undisputed masters of their world. Yet for all of its perfection, for all of its dominance, Dunkleosteus could not survive the changing world. When the conditions that supported its existence disappeared, when oxygen levels fell and temperatures shifted and food became scarce, there was no flexibility, no alternative, no backup plan. Evolution had optimized Dunkleosteus so precisely for one specific ecological role that it could not adapt to anything else. In the end, Dunkleosteus reminds us of a fundamental truth about life on Earth. Success in one era does not guarantee survival into the next. The most powerful predator, the most fearsome hunter, the most efficient killing machine can be rendered extinct by forces beyond its control. We see in Dunkleosteus a cautionary tale of specialization taken to its extreme, a warning that even the mightiest creatures are ultimately vulnerable to the forces of environmental change. Yet in fossil collections around the world, in museums and research institutions, the bones of Dunkleosteus continue to tell their story. Scientists peer at these 370-million-year-old remains and see a glimpse into a vanished world, a window into deep time when the rules of the ocean were written by an armored tyrant with jaws of bone. Through careful study and rigorous analysis, we have reconstructed something of what Dunkleosteus was: a creature of terrible beauty, an apex predator without equal, a monster that dominated the Devonian seas and then disappeared, leaving only stone and shadows as evidence of its existence. In the end, Dunkleosteus is more than just a fossil. It is a testament to evolution's power, to the infinite variety of life that this planet has produced, and to the ultimate fragility of even the greatest creatures in the face of changing times. The armored predator of the Devonian seas may be gone, but its legacy lives on in every predator that has come after, every successful predatory strategy that evolution has refined through the billions of years since Dunkleosteus drew its last breath in an ancient ocean, now turned to stone and memory.